There is a great deal of talk in the newspapers about the Academy Awards. Would you be a nominee or in any of the categories for an Academy Award?
Yes.
For Anne Bancroft, there was a double pleasure in this year's Oscar nominations, because not only was she nominated for The Miracle Worker, as a bonus, Shirley MacLaine in Two for the Seesaw was not. However, there is of course just one non-nominee that dominates the discussion until this day, and as legend has it, apparently changed the dynamics of this entire race. Yes, we cannot talk about this category without also talking about Joan Crawford. Most of all, because Feud has not only created this very specific way to look at the making of whatever happened to Baby Jane, as well as the relationship between Bette Davis and Joan, but also about this specific Oscar race, essentially casting her as the villain of this category who single-handedly robbed Bette Davis of a surefire third Best Actress win.
The last one I was definitely robbed of.
So just like in my video about Bette Davis and the making of whatever happened to Baby Jane, there is again the question, how much of all this is actually true? Was Joan really able to influence the voting? Was Bette really the overwhelming favorite? Did Anne's win really come out of nowhere? Let's dive into it. First, let's start with the most pressing issue, Joan's alleged anti-Bette campaign. Or as Bette herself said, Joan did everything she could possibly think of to keep me from winning. She campaigned openly in New York, contacting all the Oscar nominees who were in place that year. She offered to accept their Oscars if they won and were unable to attend the ceremony. She also contacted all the members of the Academy who lived in New York, requesting that they vote for one of the nominees then on Broadway. It has to be said right away that there is nothing about the whole Joan campaigning against Bette story that Bette herself enjoyed to tell later in life over and over again, and that Feud presents to us as undeniable facts that can actually be confirmed.
Miss Crawford went to New York and said to all the nominees on the stage who might not be able to get to Hollywood, I will accept your Oscar for you. And she paced New York to find people that not vote for me, because I think I lost by a very few votes.
Like with everything else regarding Feud and the relationship between Bette and Joan, it is fun to imagine all of this. I mean, Joan did end up on the Oscar stage, that is fact, though you cannot deny that something happened behind the scenes. But to what extent can only be speculated, and I can only give my personal point of view here, which is that I just cannot imagine that it truly went so far as Feud and Bette would like us to believe. I mean, yes, it's possible that Joan casually talked to some friends about the Oscars that year, but as I already said in my Bette Davis video, she was extremely careful about her public image, especially after 1954, when she had experienced that former co-stars or people she considered close friends had openly spoken out against her. Somebody talking to the press about how Joan had called and asked them to not vote for Bette would have been a publicity nightmare for her. And the fact that in all these years, nobody ever did confirm having been contacted by Joan about who to vote for, as Bette loved to claim, only tells me that it actually didn't happen. At least not to this extent, and not with this almost military precision. And as for the involvement of Hedda Hopper, there's also nothing to confirm either side, so I can only give my personal opinion that I see no reason to believe that she was actively anti-Bette and pro-Joan in all of this. In fact, Bette won Photoplay's Best Actress Award for Baby Jane, a publication Hedda Hopper herself was writing for, and Hopper herself even predicted Bette to win at the Oscars as well. So yes, Joan certainly took her own kind of revenge, by arranging that she would accept the Oscar on behalf of the absent nominees. And considering how upset Betty was about this for the rest of her life, she certainly succeeded. But I personally think that this actually was the whole extent of the so-called backstage scheming. Yes, I am doubting the legends that Joan played an active role in the voting, influencing enough Academy members to prevent Betty from winning and pushing the Oscar into another direction. Also because if we look at it from a 1962 and 63 perspective, things certainly did not seem so urgent for Joan, as she had a lot of reasons to doubt that Betty would actually win the award, making a campaign against her far less necessary. I know Betty herself often liked to proclaim herself as the undeniable favorite that year, and Feud also promotes a very clear picture of the 1962 Best Actress race, that there was the favorite Bette Davis, and then everyone else.
I'm going to be the first person to have 3 Oscars.
You're a shoo-in to win, Miss Davis. Everybody thinks so.
But she is the odds-on favorite.
But all the Vegas odds makers say the smart money is on Bette Davis.
But it's important to remember that this happens within the frame of dramatic storytelling. Joan campaigning against Betty, standing next to her in the wings listening to the announcement of the winner, and accepting for Anne Bancroft wouldn't have the same dramatic punch if we were to believe that this was a very open race. Betty needed to be the favorite to make her loss sting even more. But it's again important, just like with the making of Baby Jane, to not take all of this at face value. Because when we take a look at contemporary press coverage from 1962 and 1963 surrounding this race, it becomes clear that this was far from a done deal. Okay, yes, there was a sense that Bette Davis was certainly in the running for Oscar number 3. That is correct. However, what becomes apparent is that most of these articles don't talk about her specific performance as Baby Jane, but put a win in the usual sentimental context that so often comes up when talking about nominees who had been around for a while. And this is why many of these articles that proclaim her a favorite mention Katharine Hepburn in the same breath, stating that either of those two would most likely be the winner simply due to their status as grand stars of Hollywood past compared to the other 3 nominees. But considering that, as I mentioned in my video about her, Katharine Hepburn was in a movie that hadn't been seen by too many people up to this point and was hardly even discussed in the papers, you can attribute Kate's apparent favorite status largely to this kind of thinking. That she was an older nominee, she had been around, so she is a favorite. In the case of Betty, her movie was obviously a financial success and much more discussed, so circumstances were clearly different. But the fact that she was still essentially coupled with Katharine Hepburn in many predictions makes it clear that the thinking in her case too focused more on her longevity than her actual performance. And we know that so-called sentimental favorites don't always triumph against younger newcomers.
You have won 2 Academy Awards, if memory serves me right. And
very old boys and very tarnished. A long time ago.
Well, I think a bright, shiny new one is what is necessary and will be
Well, I
forthcoming.
think my 2 old boys will be pretty pleased, but you never know.
But what's important to highlight now is that there were various other articles at the time that gave Bette Davis a good chance for the win without the context of Katharine Hepburn or sentimentality. As I just said, even Hedda Hopper predicted her for the win. And after all, why not? The comeback of a legendary Hollywood star against all odds, and in a picture few believed in, and the opportunity to make history as the first actress to win 3 Oscars. There was a clear and compelling narrative, easy to like and admire. And the success and cultural impact of Baby Jane of course also made Bette Davis a regular item in the press prior to and after the announcement of the nominations. And Betty was also an active campaigner for her movie, her performance, and the Oscars, and she also did not make it a secret that, after closely missing out on becoming the first actress to win 2, she now definitely wanted to be the first to win 3. Yes, she really wanted that.
I was furious because that would have made me the first person with 3. And as you know, I always have to be first as an Aries.
So there certainly were many advantages in Betty's corner, and I would say that Feud is probably right when it shows her high hopes for the award and her own belief that she would win. But as just mentioned, all of this happens in a very isolated narrative where the other nominees barely play any role at all and are apparently just there to enjoy the ride, but without any chances to actually make it. And if they make it, only due to the help of Joan Crawford. But this of course overlooks how the race was actually perceived at the time, and that her co-nominees all had their own intriguing narratives as well. Yes, Katharine Hepburn's movie was underseen at this point, but she was a Hollywood icon of equal standing, also rarely appearing on the screen, so with fewer chances to award her, but with a lot more success recently than Bette Davis. And also unlike Betty, with only one Oscar at home so far, having won almost 30 years ago. So if we go by sentiment or overdue, you could give the edge to Kate. Remick was the young star who could be crowned the next sensation by the Academy, a performer who took Hollywood by storm with her natural and charming personality, but proved that she could handle heavy dramatic material just as well. Geraldine Page was clearly an actor's actor. She had now received her third Oscar nomination for her third credited screen performance, so her work was obviously adored, not just for showing a new side to her talents with Sweet Bird of Youth, but also for her talents overall. As I have said in my video about her, this was considered Geraldine Page's golden age. Why not crown it with a golden statuette? And then there was Anne Bancroft, who, let's be honest, clearly had the largest number of advantages on her side, and surely also the most intriguing narrative in this race, as she combined essentially 4 popular archetypes the Academy loves to honor. She was a newcomer, because her movie career so far had hardly been recognized and everyone only became aware of her after her return to New York. But then she was also B, a veteran who had paid her dues, because her pre-New York career did exist, and she very openly talked about it and how she needed to find herself as a serious performer instead of a starstruck starlet. Which brings us to archetype C, the actress who had mostly been known for her looks so far, or was never really taken seriously, but then surprised everyone with the actual amount of her talents. And despite only 2 stage appearances so far, the success of both plays plus her Tony wins also made her D, a veteran of the stage, who recreated her big success. And the 1950s and 60s were in general extremely generous to this group and resulted in various Oscar wins, prompting Bette Davis to say that there should be 2 separate Oscar categories for actors recreating a role and those creating it completely new. And I mean, you can understand her frustration when you consider that she lost all of her last 3 Oscar bids to actresses recreating a stage role. But of course, this also makes Betty's claim that Joan Crawford campaigned in New York's acting circles against her rather doubtful, because let's be honest, voters located in the East would most likely have voted for either Geraldine Page or Anne Bancroft anyway, or even Katharine Hepburn, who was appearing in a movie based on an important play. And while I have said that Bette Davis made the rounds in the media prior to the Oscars, Anne Bancroft was very active in this regard too, appearing on behalf of the movie on various TV shows and events in LA or New York, and always to very glowing reactions.
Can you sing What's My Line with your hand?
Oh, well, we'll do this because I know where it's going. They'll all go.
She did it. That's it.
Yes, actually, that Miss Anne was answering with her hands sideways.
Yeah.
She was? Yeah.
We didn't know that, of course.
Well, we are much honored, Miss Anne, much honored to have had you with us, and I trust that you took as much joy from your wonderful work in the miracle work as we've all had from being able to see it.
Probably more. Thank you.
Miss Bancroft is one of the nominees for the Best Actress in the Oscar proceedings, the Academy Awards, tomorrow night for her performance in the movie of the Miracle Worker, and you have 2 votes, and my daughter and I have been voting for you all week, so that we certainly hope you make it.
And let's not forget that even Katharine Hepburn was far more accessible in this Oscar season than ever before, doing many interviews about Long Day's journey into night and her career in general. Voters were therefore clearly not voting against Bette Davis, as a certain TV show would like you to believe, but instead they voted for their favorite, for the performance that appealed to them and it fit the narrative of the times.
Is it possible for one person to influence the voting of the Academy so that maybe you might not get a fair shake, or maybe somebody gets it who is not so deserving? Did you ever experience any politicking going on there?
Well, now, of course, it's hard to tell because they advertise today.
Yeah, it's a big
See,
push.
in my day, they never advertised. I
Yeah.
am against that.
Yeah.
I think it should just be people who saw a film and liked it.
On the merits of
But
the
they
performance.
put out big campaigns
Yeah.
to win.
And all of this explains why nobody at the time considered this a done race, but rather one that hadn't been so unpredictable in a long time. Most editors actually declared Geraldine Page and Anne Bancroft the favorites, some others Katharine Hepburn or Bette Davis. One newspaper asked former Oscar winners Dean Jagger and Karl Malden for their predictions. Malden predicted Geraldine Page, Jagger Anne Bancroft. The only one considered to not have a chance in this race was Remick. As I said in my video about her, many felt that she was overshadowed by Jack Lemmon, and despite the fact that she had been in the business for a couple of years already, she was seen as a novice competing with 4 veterans. Another important factor to consider when predicting the Oscars was that the New York film critics, at the time seen as the most important precursor, did not vote on the best movie and the best performances that year due to a newspaper strike. This only added to the overall openness of the category and why predictions were essentially all over the place. But when you talk about the advantages in an Oscar race, we also need to look at the disadvantages. And while Katharine Hepburn might have been in an underseen movie, or Remick overshadowed by her co-star, the truth is that nobody had more things going against her than Bette Davis. Being never shy to say what's on her mind, she clearly enjoyed the fact that Baby Jane and her performance were such a success despite everyone's doubts. But this kind of talk is also unlikely to make you any friends, especially compared to Anne Bancroft, who always appeared very humble in her new success, always blaming herself and single-minded obsession with fame and star culture when she first went to Hollywood, and not the studios or any executives. I can't blame Hollywood for anything. I blame myself for what happened to me out there. She presented herself as someone who had grown and redefined herself. So the kind of Cinderella story Oscar voters love, especially since it was assumed that Anne Bancroft would now return to Hollywood more regularly. An Oscar for her was an investment. On the other hand, would it really do anything for Bette Davis at this point?
Let's talk to Anne Bancroft a minute about this magnificent movie, The Miracle Worker, and it is a wonderful movie, and isn't it? Isn't it? Oh, it's something. But Anne, I understand that you have recently been recognized with the first of many awards, I know.
Yes, we just came back from San Sebastian and we won the Film Festival award there.
In San Sebastian?
Yes.
The movie did, and you did too.
Yes.
Oh, what a... And an Oscar? She's got to get an Oscar. I bet she gets an Oscar.
Anne's humble nature also stood in large contrast to Betty's attitude, and how she openly discussed that she not only wanted to win, but that she also deserved to win. An attitude most likely not appealing to many Academy members.
And I should have had it all. Very immodest of me. I should have had it.
And then of course, the biggest disadvantage for Betty was simply the kind of movie and kind of role she was nominated for, and how seriously many Academy members actually took all of this.
Your sister, Olivia de Havilland, did some of the horror movies. Did you talk to her about it? Why?
No, I didn't.
You wonder why someone like, I guess they just want to keep...
It was a vogue at the time, and Bette Davis was doing them, and Joan Crawford was doing them, and they might have thought it was kind of an amusing thing to do, and another facet. And I think, as we were just saying, maybe they wanted to prove that they could play all kinds of parts. Well, fine.
In discussing whatever happened to Baby Jane, one newspaper ran this cartoon that shows the Addams family turning away from the movie in disgust, just to give you a feeling of how some people at the time thought of it. And we know how hard it is for genre movies to triumph at the Oscars, especially if they are not seen as serious or prestigious. And whatever happened to Baby Jane certainly was neither. It did become an Oscar-winning movie thanks to its costume design, but as we just learned again, some genres don't get wins in the top categories. I mean, the overdue Agnes Moorehead couldn't even win her first Oscar in the supporting category for Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte 2 years later. The so-called hexploitation genre was clearly not to the Academy's taste, and a major acting win therefore highly unlikely, and even a nomination not guaranteed. After all, Bette Davis did not receive one for Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, and neither did all the other actresses who later tried their hands in the genre. Many articles predicting the Oscar nominations in 1962 did not even see Bette Davis as a likely contender, but rather as someone with a small outside chance, together with Joan Crawford. There was consequently little coverage that mentioned surprise about the fact that Joan wasn't nominated, but rather about the fact that Bette Davis was. And the thing is, these doubts about Betty's chances for an Oscar nomination were not only caused by the movie she was appearing in, but also by Betty's actual performance. In my video about Bette Davis, I have only focused on the positive reviews for her work, but the truth is that her performance was just as divisive as the movie she was appearing in, and she was heavily criticized in many outlets as well, some accusing her of excessive rug chewing, and that she hadn't more to do than wear grotesque costumes and makeup to look like a witch, and that, quote, Davis gives a performance that cannot be called great acting, but can only be regarded as a travesty. So it's not surprising that her Oscar nomination was actually met with a lot of venom in the press, even called a joke or a macabre gag. None of her co-nominees experienced this kind of backlash to their work or their nominations, again making it clear that Bette Davis was never going to have an easy road to an Oscar win. In 1962, the involvement of a giant like Bette Davis in a movie like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was new and exciting enough for Academy members to overcome some of the dubiousness about the actual quality presented on the screen, but a nomination and an actual win are two very different things. A nomination can be a pat on the back, a congratulation, an acknowledgement of a comeback few had considered possible. But when they vote for the winner, Academy members usually look for something else, especially if the field offers far more prestigious alternatives. And among these alternatives, Anne Bancroft offered everything you can ask for. A compelling narrative for triumphantly reshaping her career. A future as the screen's most important new talent, considered a female Marlon Brando due to her brooding intensity. And then, quite simply, the most unique and Oscar-friendly performance, impressing with an almost revolutionary physicality and a kind of strong, determined female character that hadn't been seen on the screen in a long time. I mean, let's take a simple look at this category. Alcoholic, alcoholic and crazy, addicted to morphine, kind of alcoholic and drug addicted, and a woman who teaches Helen Keller the meaning of words. It's not difficult to understand Oscar voters' preferences. So to come back to the beginning of the talk about this Oscar race, a detailed look at the circumstances at the time shows that there was probably not much need for Joan Crawford to truly conduct an anti-Betty campaign or actively promote her competitors, because these competitors, and most of all Anne Bancroft, had enough going for them to win this Oscar all by themselves. Most likely Joan simply observed how the race was seen, did the math on how likely it was that Betty would lose, and took a chance that, for her, paid off in the best possible way.
Accepting for Anne Bancroft, Miss Joan Crawford.
Oh, and just to cover the story completely, let's also put this story that Betty loved to tell for the rest of her life, finally to rest.
She also traveled with it for 1 year. No, 1 year, with Pepsi-Cola. And she told Miss Bancroft that she would bathe this Oscar in all the waters of the world.
Again, it's a wonderfully entertaining story, but it's actually well documented by New York newspapers that Joan presented Anne with the Oscar after a performance of Mother Courage in early May, about 1 month after the Oscars. Mother Courage was also not as successful as Two for the Seesaw or The Miracle Worker and closed on May 11, so another proof that Joan couldn't have kept the Oscar for 1 year. When Anne was later interviewed about her win and asked if she deserved the Oscar, she answered, "Well, if that means, was I better than anyone else? The answer is yes." She remembered her reaction to the win as, I cried and I laughed and I shouted, and the doorbell started to sing, and the wire services were on the phone. There were photographers parked across the street. I'll be much easier to live with. It's very important to a certain part of you. What is it going to do to me professionally? Ask me in a couple of years. All I know is that as soon as you conquer one thing, only then do you begin to see what's next in life. So for me, it was important to shed some light on a performance and an Oscar win that is often only discussed in connection to who lost, as a win that could only happen because of backstage drama by a bitter non-nominee, a win that stole the award from a more iconic performance. But it's important to look behind the drama and see that this Oscar awarded one of the most acclaimed performances in years and an astonishing career revival by a wonderfully talented actress.